The candles in the great hall at Ashford had been lit since 4 o'clock, and by 7 the room held that particular winter warmth that comes only when 30 people have gathered close against the cold outside. The long table was set with silver that caught the light like water. The guests were dressed as if the season had not ended, as if the countryside were London, and the occasion something more than a quiet announcement in a house still officially in half-mourning. Lady Sophronia Calder had chosen the date with care. Her son Edmund stood at the far end of the room near the fire, a glass of claret in his hand, speaking to Lord Vane about nothing in particular, and the vertical line between his brows had not relaxed in 7 years. The door opened. No one heard it open, precisely. The room noticed it the way rooms notice disruption, a ripple of turned heads, a pull of attention from some instinct older than manners. A woman stood in the doorway. She wore a traveling cloak, dark with cold and damp, and beneath it a gown the color of winter sage. She had not been announced. The butler stood behind her, with an expression suggesting he had tried and failed to prevent the entrance. Her dark hair was disordered from the road. Her gray eyes moved directly, without faltering, to the man by the fire. She said his name once, quietly, and then she said it plainly. "You never buried me." Edmund Calder, Viscount Ashford, dropped his glass. The claret spread across the floor like something released after long confinement. No one moved to retrieve it. 30 people arranged around the finest table in the county stood entirely still, and the only sound was the fire, and the distant wind against the windows, and the ringing of the glass where it had struck the hearthstone. Edmund's face had gone the color of the white cravat at his throat. His eyes were fixed on the woman in the doorway with an expression that was not recognition exactly, because recognition implies the thing recognized was expected, and he had not expected her in any room of any house in England or elsewhere for 7 years. It was something before recognition, something that happened in the chest before the mind caught up to it. She stepped into the room. She was thinner than she had been. There was a small scar at her left eyebrow he had never seen. She walked exactly as she had always walked, with that particular quality of stillness and motion that he had described once privately to himself as the most composed thing he had ever watched move across a room. She walked toward him, and the crowd parted, and no one spoke. Lady Sophronia was the first to find her voice. "What is the meaning of this?" she said. Not a question. The woman did not look at her. She looked only at Edmund. He did not speak. He could not, yet. His hand was still open at his side where the glass had been, and he was looking at Cecily Hartwell, who was his wife, who had been dead for 7 years, who was standing in his dining room with cold in her cloak and grief in her gray eyes, and 7 years of unanswered questions distributed across her face like weather. "Edmund," she said again softly, and something in the way she said it, the particular quality of exhaustion and precision in the single word, was what finally reached him. He said her name, Cecily, and the room held its breath. She was 20 years old when she left England. That was the fact that preceded every other fact, the one she had returned to so many times across 7 years that it no longer felt like information, and more like the shape of a wound. 20 years old, and married 8 months, and in love, in the particular way that is also terror, because she could not yet believe the thing she had been given was hers to keep. Edmund had arranged the passage to Lisbon. Her brother Thomas, 3 years younger than she and recently commissioned, had taken a fever of the lungs in Portugal, and the word that reached London was ambiguous enough that Cecily could not stay home. Edmund was to follow in 3 weeks. There was a parliamentary obligation, a delay he did not choose, a date he could not move. She understood. She had said she understood, and she meant it. Because she did. She sailed in September. The voyage was rough. That was a detail she had since stopped telling, because no one who had not been at sea in autumn understood what rough meant. She arrived in Lisbon ill herself, a fever that the surgeon aboard tried to treat with cooling cloths and failed. Thomas was already recovering when she reached the house where he was quartered, which was a relief that arrived simultaneously with the news that she herself had become the patient. The weeks that followed were a matter of surviving days, 1 at a time, and then 2 at a time, and then finally a week at a time. The ship's surgeon had sent word to England. She learned this later from Thomas. The word the surgeon sent was not optimistic. It had not been intended as a death notice, exactly, but it had been received as one, interpreted as one, acted upon as one, by people in England who were looking at a document written in a frightened man's hand at sea and choosing, consciously or not, what it meant. She wrote to Edmund from her sickbed in Lisbon. She wrote 3 letters before she was well enough to sit upright, and then she wrote again when she was. She wrote when the money Thomas had arranged allowed her passage home on a slower vessel, and she wrote again from Bordeaux and again from Calais. The letters were addressed to Ashford Hall, to Edmund's London house, to Edmund in care of his solicitor. She received no reply to any of them. She arrived in England in November, a year after she had left, and discovered that she was dead. The notice had been printed in the London papers. A brief formal announcement, worded in the language of condolence, signed with the Ashford family's authority. Thomas had not known about it either. He had assumed, as she had assumed, that the mismatch between the surgeon's alarming correspondence and the reality of her survival would have been corrected by her own letters. He had been wrong. They had both been wrong. She stood in the reading room of a small inn outside Dover with a newspaper in her hands and read her own death. And what she felt, standing there, was something she would not be able to name for a long time. She did not go to Ashford Hall. She ought to have, perhaps. Her letters had gone unanswered, all of them, and the notice had been placed with such formal decisiveness, and she was arriving from France with her brother and a single trunk between them in a constitution that had not fully recovered. And there was something in the silence that had surrounded her name for a year that felt less like oversight and more like intention. She told herself she was being irrational. She told herself exhaustion made the world look darker than it was, but she did not go. Thomas arranged a small position for her through a distant cousin in Gloucestershire, a family who asked no inconvenient questions and were glad of a woman who could manage accounts and keep a library in order. She did not use her married name. She was Miss Hartwell again, in that household, and she stayed Miss Hartwell for 6 years, while Edmund remained a widower, while Ashford Hall remained closed to a woman it did not know was alive. What changed was a letter from Thomas, who had by then returned to London and moved in circles that occasionally intersected with those of the Calder family. He wrote that Lady Sophronia had arranged a betrothal. He wrote that the girl was suitable, connected, and expected to be announced before Christmas. He wrote that Edmund looked, by all accounts, like a man who had not slept well in years. She read the letter twice. Then she put on her traveling cloak and went to Ashford. The morning after the dinner, Ashford Hall held a particular quality of suspension, the way a house holds itself after an event it has not finished processing. The guests had been offered rooms for the night, rather than sent home in the dark and cold, and they occupied those rooms with the self-conscious quiet of people who understood they had witnessed something that would be spoken of for years. Cicely had been shown to a room in the East Wing. She had not slept in it. She had sat in the chair beside the window and watched the snow begin somewhere around 2 in the morning, and she had listened to the house settle, and she had considered what she had done. She had no legal standing that anyone had yet confirmed. She was a woman who had walked out of the dark and said a thing in a crowded room, and the crowded room had watched Edmund drop his glass, and that was the sum of what had happened so far. It was not nothing. It was not enough yet, either. The housekeeper, a compact, gray-haired woman named Mrs. Finch, who had been at Ashford longer than Edmund had been alive, knocked at Cecily's door at 7 in the morning with a tray and an expression of controlled feeling. "His lordship asks if you will take breakfast in the morning room," Mrs. Finch said. "At your convenience." "Thank you," Cecily said. "I will." Lady Sophronia was not at breakfast. Edmund was, standing rather than sitting at the window that looked onto the gardens, with a cup of coffee that he held without drinking. He turned when Cecily entered. He was trying, she could see, to be measured. He had had the night, as she had, to reorder the world around. This fact, the vertical line between his brows was more pronounced in daylight, and there was something in his face that she could not entirely read, which was new. She had always been able to read his face. Grief, she thought. Not surprise anymore. Grief, which was perhaps worse. "You should sit," he said. "You look as though you have not slept." "I have not," she said. "Have you?" He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. They sat across the breakfast table from each other, and it occurred to Cecily that she had sat across this table from him perhaps 40 times in the 8 months of their marriage, and that the table felt exactly the same, and entirely different, and that she was very tired. "I did not know," Edmund said at last. "I received word that you had died. I believed it. I wrote to you," she said. "Many times." He looked at her steadily. "I received nothing." She held his gaze. His eyes were the same particular shade of dark that she had tried to describe to herself over 7 years, and always failed. Not brown exactly. Something closer to the color of good leather in firelight. "Then something is wrong," she said, with a post. He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Yes." Later that morning, Lady Sophronia sought Cecily in the gallery, where Cecily had gone to look at a particular watercolor of the Ashford grounds that she remembered from her first visit to the Hall 6 weeks before her marriage. Sophronia moved with the deliberate authority of a woman who had ordered this house for 30 years and did not intend to cede that authority to a ghost. "I am glad you are alive," Sophronia said, and the way she said it conveyed that glad was a complicated word. "Naturally, Edmund is affected. This has been a considerable shock for the entire family." "I am sure it has been," Cecily said. Sophronia turned to regard the watercolor beside her. "There are practical matters to be arranged, questions of standing, of documentation. None of this is simple." "No," Cecily agreed. "None of it is." Sophronia looked at her directly then. "She was buried, Edmund. Whatever walks through that door is not your wife." She had said those words to him last night in the corridor outside the dining room, before Cecily was out of earshot, and Cecily had heard them clearly. Now Sophronia said with precision, "This house has been in grief. We do not need it disrupted further by complications." "I am not a complication," Cecily said. "I am his wife." Sophronia's fan held at her side moved a fraction of an inch. "We shall see what the solicitors say." She left Cecily alone in the gallery, and Cecily stood for a long moment looking at the watercolor of the grounds, the stone manor in the distance, the winter light in the painted sky. Then she walked to the window and watched the snow still falling outside, and she understood that she had perhaps won the first exchange, and had not won anything at all. It was the second morning that Edmund saw her with the child. The tenant farmer Bellamy's youngest daughter had followed her mother to the Hall on an errand, and the child, who was perhaps 5 years old and had lost a boot somewhere in the snow of the kitchen garden, was sitting on the stone step of the east entrance, making no sound at all, which was the particular silence of a child who has decided that crying will not help. Cecily came around the corner of the hall with her cloak on and her hands red with cold and stopped at the sight of her. Edmund had been crossing from the stable yard to the house when he saw Cecily sit down on the step beside the child, in the snow, in her good traveling cloak. He stopped. She did not remove the child's remaining boot. She took off one of her own gloves instead, and she held it over the child's bare foot, and she began to talk in the low, even voice she sometimes used. He remembered now when she was concentrating on keeping someone else comfortable. The child leaned against her side with the pragmatic trust of small children who recognize the quality of a person's attention before they know anything else about them. Edmund stood in the archway of the stable yard and watched, and did not move. The cold was considerable. His breath was visible in the air. He was aware of it in the way he was aware of most physical facts this morning, at a remove, as though the cold and the morning and the particular gray quality of the light on the snow were things happening to someone else. While the thing happening to him was the sight of Cecily sitting on a stone step in the snow and covering a child's cold foot with her own glove, She had not looked up to see if anyone was watching. That was the thing he kept returning to, standing in the archway. She had not performed the kindness. She had simply done it, with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness she had always brought to whatever was directly in front of her, and she was talking to the child now, something low and steady, and the child's face had gone from the particular neutrality of brave endurance to something warmer. He had sent for a surgeon when she collapsed at the breakfast table yesterday because she had fainted, briefly, and he had been across the room before she finished falling. He had not planned to be. He had simply been there, his hand at her elbow, her weight catching against his chest, and the shock of her actual physical presence, the solid fact of her after years of a ghost, had been so severe that he had stood holding her upright for a full minute before the housekeeper arrived. He had told himself it was shock. He was not certain that was all it was. The child's mother appeared from the kitchen door and retrieved her daughter and thanked Cecily with the plain warmth of someone who did not know or care about the questions of standing and documentation currently occupying the rest of the house. Cecily stood brushing snow from her cloak and turned and saw Edmund in the archway. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Your boot will be wet," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should come inside." She came inside. On the third evening, Cecily found the gap in the correspondence by accident. She had been permitted the use of the morning room and had spent 2 hours organizing the letter she had brought from Gloucestershire. Evidence of her 7 years, documents that established her existence in a form the solicitors could review. She was looking for a letter from the ship's surgeon, a copy she had requested and received years ago, when she opened the wrong drawer of the writing desk in the corner of the room and found a sheaf of papers that did not belong to her. They were copies of household accounts, neatly kept, in Sophronia's hand. Nothing unusual in that. Beneath them was a letter in an unfamiliar hand, addressed to Lady Ashford, and below that another, and when Cecily looked more carefully at the stack, she saw that they were all addressed to Edmund, and all redirected by his mother's notation at the corner. Diverted, with the date written alongside, she did not take them. She put them back exactly as she had found them, and she closed the drawer, and she sat for a moment very still because she was doing arithmetic. She had noticed in the past 3 days that Edmund's solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, had been at the Hall, and that he had spent a considerable time closeted with Sophronia before meeting with Edmund, and that the meeting with Edmund had been brief. She had noticed that Lady Philippa Vane was still in residence, quietly, in the south wing with the polished composure of a young woman waiting to see what the situation would produce. She had noticed that Mrs. May Finch, the housekeeper, watched Cecily with an expression of careful loyalty not yet offered to either side. At dinner that evening, Sophronia sat at the head of the table with Lady Philippa at her right hand, and she said to the 3 remaining houseguests, in the clear, pleasant tone of a woman making an announcement, "She was buried. We all mourned her, and we were right too. I do not know who this woman is, but I know that grief does not benefit from being reopened by impostors." One of the guests, a woman called Mrs. Alderton, looked at Cecily across the table. Cecily set down her fork. "Lady Philippa," she said, looking not at Sophronia, but at the young woman who had been positioned as her replacement, "I am sorry that you find yourself at the center of this. It was not arranged by your doing." Philippa, to her credit, looked at her directly. "No," she said, "it was not." Edmund had not spoken. He sat at the foot of the table with the same vertical line between his brows, and he watched, and Cecily could not entirely read what he was watching for. But he had not agreed with his mother. "What, Mrs. Finch said to Cecily," she said in the corridor outside the East Wing that same night, quietly, as one who has spent decades knowing which information goes where. "Her ladyship, Mrs. Merce Finch has said, in the hearing of the kitchen staff, that you were buried and ought to stay that way. I thought you should know the phrase exactly as it was used." Cecily looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch." "His lordship," Mrs. Finch said, "has not been well since you left in the way. A house is not well when someone has taken the lamp out of the front room." She paused. arranging her words. "I thought you should know that too." She left Cecily alone in the corridor. The dark moment arrived, not as catastrophe, but as paper. Mr. Fenwick presented himself to Cecily on the fourth morning with the measured courtesy of a solicitor conveying unpleasant things in pleasant language. The documents he placed before her were procedural and careful, and what they described, in their procedural and careful way, was a process for confirming her identity that would take a minimum of several months, during which she would be asked, for the sake of clarity and decorum, to remove herself from Ashford Hall. She asked if these were Lord Ashford's instructions. Mr. Fenwick said they were the instructions of the family. She asked if Lord Ashford had signed them. Mr. Fenwick paused for precisely 1 second. He said that his lordship had agreed that process must be followed. She did not ask anything further. She thanked Mr. Menta. Fenwick and she sat for a time in the morning room after he had gone, and she considered what it meant for process to be followed. She had known, coming back to England, that the path would not be simple. She had not permitted herself to imagine that Edmund would simply open the door and take her hand. She was not a woman who allowed herself that kind of imagining, particularly when the evidence against it had been accumulating for 7 years. She had written letters. They had gone unanswered. She began to pack. She wrote a final letter to Edmund, which she left on the writing desk of the morning room, folded and sealed with her name. She did not read it over before she sealed it. She wrote what she meant precisely, without softening it, and she sealed it before she could revise it into something smaller and safer. Then she put on her traveling cloak and asked Mrs. Finch if there was a conveyance available. "There is always a carriage," Mrs. Finch said, with an expression she did not elaborate. It was evening when Edmund went to his mother's writing room, looking for a household document that concerned the Eastern tenants, a record of agreements made before Cecily left that had never been properly transcribed into the main estate ledgers. He had been meaning to find it for months. He found it in the second drawer of his mother's desk beneath a sheaf of household accounts, and beneath the accounts he found the letters. There were 11 of them. He knew Cecily's handwriting the way he knew the proportions of the rooms in this house, so thoroughly and for so long that recognition was physical rather than intellectual. He stood in his mother's writing room with 11 letters in his hands, and he stood there for a time that he could not afterward have measured. The earliest one was dated October, the year she left. She was recovering, she wrote. The fever had broken. Thomas was much improved. She had been frightened. She said, using the past tense, and the past tense told him everything about how carefully she was trying not to alarm him with what she had already survived. She asked if he was. Well, she asked about the parliamentary session. She asked if the Westfield drainage had been resolved. The Westfield drainage. She was recovering from a fever that had nearly killed her, and she was asking about the Westfield drainage because she knew he had been worried about it. The letters that followed mapped her recovery and her slowly gathering bewilderment. The third letter mentioned, with deliberate understatement, that she had not yet received a reply, and attributed this to the irregularity of the post. The fifth letter mentioned it again, with less understatement. The seventh letter asked plainly whether he had received her previous correspondence, and said that she was beginning to be concerned. The eighth letter said that she had learned of the notice in the paper. The words of that letter were very carefully chosen and very carefully controlled, and the control of them was more devastating than anything uncontrolled could have been. The final letter was dated November, more than a year after she had left. She had written it in the plain declarative of a woman who had stopped softening things. I believed you would want to know that I am alive. I see now that the circumstances require you to receive that information, without my presence at Ashford. I remain your wife-in-law, and you know where to find me if that matters to you. Edmund sat down in his mother's chair, with 11 letters in his hands. She had been alive. She had written. She had written 11 times, and received no answer, and she had concluded, as any rational person would have concluded, that the silence was deliberate. She had stayed away, because she believed he did not want her, and she had been kept away, and the staying and the keeping were not the same thing, and he had been the instrument of neither. But he had stood by while someone who loved him made him an instrument anyway. He thought of the morning room. He thought of the carriage Mrs. Finch had mentioned when he passed the kitchen passage an hour ago, and the way Mrs. Finch had looked at him when she said it. He said his mother's name once, into the empty room. Then he put the letters inside his coat, and he went to find Cecily. She was not in her room. She was not in the morning room, though her coat was gone from the peg. The carriage was gone from the stable yard. He stood in the stable yard in the dark and cold and looked at the tracks in the snow and understood from their direction that she had taken the Fenwick road toward the village. He saddled his own horse. The snow had stopped falling, but the road was white, and the night was clear and cold, and she had perhaps 20 minutes on him, which was the calculation of a man who had ridden this road since he was 12 years old, and knew every bend of it. The inn at Ashford Village was the nearest shelter. He pushed the horse harder than he should have on a snow-covered road, and arrived at the village in less time than the mathematics suggested was likely. The inn yard was lit. The carriage was in it. There were other witnesses to what happened next, which was not what Edmund had planned, though in hindsight he understood that it was perhaps necessary. The innkeeper was in the yard, and 2 of his stable hands and 3 other travelers who had stopped for the night, and Mrs. Burda. Alderton, who had been making her way home from Ashford Hall at the same slow pace, and had stopped at the inn for the same reasons of darkness and cold. Mrs. Alderton was a woman of large acquaintance and considerable memory, and Edmund registered her presence and continued past her toward the inn door. Cecily had not yet gone up. She was in the front room, speaking to the innkeeper's wife, and when she turned and saw Edmund, she went very still. He crossed the room. He was still in his riding clothes, and there was snow on his coat and his hat, and he was holding 11 letters, which he held out to her without preamble. She looked at the letters. She looked at his face. Some of the composure she had been wearing for 4 days shifted very slightly in the region of her eyes. "Where?" she said carefully. "My mother's desk," he said. "The second drawer." She took the letters. She looked at the top one, the October letter, the one with her own handwriting on the face of it, her name and his, and the Ashford address and his mother's notation in the corner. The room had gone quiet. Edmund was aware of the innkeeper, and his wife, and the travelers and Mrs. Alderton, and he did not attend to any of them. "Cecily," he said. She was looking at the letters. She was not crying, but there was something in the set of her mouth that told him she was not far from it, and that she was choosing not to be, which was entirely characteristic of her, and which he had missed for 7 years without having a name for what he was missing. He said it simply, "I never stopped." She looked up. He said it again quietly, because it was 3 words that described 7 years. "I never stopped." Lady Sophronia arrived at the inn at 9:15, having been brought by carriage by Mr. Pratt. Fenwick, who was attempting to perform his function as family solicitor, and finding the situation more complicated than family solicitors generally prefer. She entered the front room of the inn and found her son standing beside a woman she had decided 7 years ago to set aside. And she found the woman holding 11 letters, and she found Mrs. Alderton watching from the corner chair, with the expression of a woman assembling a sentence she intended to repeat many times. "Edmund," Sophronia said, "this is not the place." "No," Edmund said, "it is not. We are here, and that is sufficient. This woman's claims are still unverified. The process Mr. Fenwick described was reasonable, and what you are doing now will only complicate the legal question further." Edmund looked at his mother steadily. He had been doing arithmetic, too, standing in the inn-room with 11 letters and 7 years of silence, and the arithmetic had produced a number that was not what his mother had intended, and was not what she could undo. "She is my wife," he said. He said it once, plainly, in the level voice that he used for things that were settled. "She has always been my wife." Sophronia opened her mouth. "There is nothing more to discuss," he said. The room held its silence. Mrs. Alderton in the corner did not move. Mr. Fenwick looked at his hands. The innkeeper's wife quietly withdrew. The travelers who had been attempting to pretend they were not present gave up the pretense and looked directly. Edmund turned back to Cecily. She was watching him with the gray eyes that he had been unable to describe to himself for 7 years, and in them was something he recognized as the slow collapse of a belief she had carried for a very long time and at considerable cost. She had believed he chose silence. She was releasing that belief in front of him, carefully, the way one sets down something heavy that has changed the shape of one's hands. "Edmund," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. What he felt, holding her hand in the front room of the Ashford Village Inn, with snow outside, and witnesses and his mother's controlled silence, and 7 years of letters pressed between them, was not precisely triumph. It was something older and quieter and more like what it felt like the first time he had held her hand, at the edge of his mother's garden in the summer before they married, and understood that this was the person he had been waiting to meet, without knowing he was waiting. He had had that feeling once and lost it, and held the absence of it for 7 years without understanding what he was holding. She did not look at Sophronia. She did not look at Mrs. Alderton. She looked at him. "You have snow on your coat," she said. "I rode fast," he said. I noticed something, almost like the expression she had remembered. In his last weeks of warmth, before the guilt and grief set in, moved across his face. She had forgotten it could move that way. "Come back," he said. "Come back to Ashford." "Yes," she said. Sophronia was not cruel, and she was not a villain, and she was a woman who had made a calculated decision born of the conviction that the hierarchy she had spent her life inside knew better than anything so inconvenient as a wife returned from the dead. She was also in the end a woman who recognized a closed argument when she was standing inside one. She spoke to Edmund the following morning in private, and she said what she had to say, which was not apology exactly, but was the closest thing to it that she was capable of. And Edmund listened and said very little, and when she finished he said that the letters would be returned to Cecily, all of them, and that there would be no further management of his correspondence. Sophronia said quietly, "I wanted what was best for you." "I know," Edmund said. That was the end of it, as far as the formal accounting went. Lady Philippa left Ashford Hall that same morning with the self-possession of a young woman who had always understood the situation more clearly than the people arranging it, and who was, by her own private accounting, rather relieved. She sent Cecily a note of 4 words. "I am glad you came back." It was unsigned, which was the correct choice. Thomas Hartwell arrived at Ashford 4 days later, having been sent for by Cecily. He was 24 years old, and in the uniform of a lieutenant, and he was still too thin from the illness that had taken the 2 of them to Portugal and rearranged the rest of their lives. And when Edmund opened the door to him, he stood on the step and looked at Edmund, with the particular expression of a younger sibling who has been watching the clock run for years and has a great many opinions about it. "She wrote to you 11 times, Thomas said. "I know," Edmund said. "Come inside." Thomas came inside. By Christmas the legal questions were settled, which was faster than Mr. Settle. Fenwick had predicted, and was the result of Edmund being a man who, once he had determined what he wanted, moved through bureaucratic processes with a deliberate efficiency that had served him well in Parliament and served him even better in the resolution of his own life. Mr. Fenwick, who was a practical man, was relieved. The documentation was signed. The announcement was placed briefly in the London papers, in the small formal language of correction. An error of record. An error of record, and 7 years, and 11 letters. The hall was warm by Christmas. Not in the particular performative way it had been warm for the winter dinner, the 30 candles in the formal silver, but warm in the way a house is warm when it has stopped being held in suspension. Thomas was in the East Wing, arguing with Mrs. Finch about the proper way to lay a fire, and losing, because Mrs. Finch had been winning that argument with young men for 30 years. The snow outside was clean and still. Edmund found Cecily in the library. She was sitting in the chair by the window, with the 11 letters in her lap. Not reading them, just holding them. The fire was built up behind her, and she had taken off her shoes and tucked her feet beneath her, which was something she had done. He remembered suddenly, in the 8 months of their marriage, when she was comfortable, and did not know she was being observed. She had stopped doing it the moment she noticed him. He leaned against the doorframe and did not announce himself. She had not noticed the scar above her own eyebrow from the illness. She did not know he had spent 4 days memorizing it. She was looking at the fire with the gray eyes that caught the light, a particular way, darker in the center, and lighter at the edge, and she was not wearing the expression of composed dignity that she had worn through all the days of negotiation and documentation and the slow rearranging of the world. She was wearing the expression she wore when she was not thinking about being seen, and it was the expression of a woman who was tentatively warm. He said her name. She looked up startled, and then not startled, and something in the way she relaxed when she saw it was him made him want to lean against the doorframe for the rest of his life. "Come, sit with me," she said. He came and sat with her. He did not take the letters. She kept them in her lap, and he sat beside her, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm. And for a time they did not speak. And the fire said everything the fire always says, which is that the world outside is cold and the world inside is not, and that this distinction is a thing worth attending to. "I am sorry," he said. "You did not know," she said. "I should have looked further, perhaps," she said. "I should have come home sooner. You thought I did not want you." "I thought," she said carefully, "that you had chosen something you did not know how to undo." She paused. "I understand that kind of choosing." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. "I never stopped," he said, "because it was still the truest thing he had." She turned her head and looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes, dark at the center and light at the edge, and then she put her head on his shoulder. Outside, the snow fell on the Ashford grounds, on the stone, and the frozen garden, and the fields that stretched to the village and the road she had ridden away on, and the road he had ridden after her. It fell clean and even, the way new snow always does, as if the ground beneath it had never held anything difficult. She still had the letters in her hands. His arm was around her. The fire was warm. 11 letters. 7 years. And all of it worth bearing now, because it had arrived here. If this story found you, leave a comment below with your favorite moment, and thank you, truly, for staying until the end.